I still remember the exact smell of rosin dust in that auditorium. 16 years old, standing on a stage that suddenly felt like the edge of a cliff, holding sheet music that represented 2 years of work I'd done in secret. In my bedroom, hunched over a second-hand keyboard with headphones on, so I wouldn't wake my parents. The composition was called Departure in Minor, and it was the first thing I'd ever written that felt like it came from somewhere real inside me. Not just exercises and techniques I'd copied from better musicians. My hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the kind of electric anticipation you feel when you're about to show someone something you made, something that matters. I'd practiced the performance maybe 300 times. I knew every note, every dynamic shift, every moment where the left hand had to carry the melody, while the right created this cascading pattern that sounded like rain on glass. I thought I was ready. Charles Blackwood sat, in the third row, directly center. He always sat there during student performances, his posture perfect, his expression carefully neutral. He was maybe 50 then. With gray threading through dark hair he kept swept back from a high forehead. Everyone knew who he was. He'd conducted for the Boston Philharmonic in his 20s, had recordings that some of the music students traded like contraband, had connections at Juilliard and Berkeley and the New England Conservatory. He'd taken the position at Lincoln Park High School 5 years earlier, and the orchestra program had transformed. We'd gone from playing simplified arrangements at local nursing homes to performing at regional competitions, placing in state tournaments, sending graduates to serious music schools. If Charles Blackwood said you had talent, doors opened. If he said you didn't, they closed. I started playing. The opening was simple, almost too simple, just a repeated motif in the bass that established the key. Then the right hand came in with the main theme, this melody that climbed and fell back on itself, always reaching but never quite resolving. I'd written it thinking about leaving home, about the feeling of wanting something you can't name, about being 17 and knowing that everything you are now is temporary, but not knowing what comes next. The auditorium had maybe 200 people in it. Other students, parents, a few teachers. During the middle section, where the tempo shifted and the harmonies got more complex, I heard someone cough. Then silence again. Just the piano and my breathing and the sound of my fingers on the keys. I finished. The final chord hung in the air, sustained by the pedal, gradually fading. I looked up. Charles Blackwood was already standing, not to applaud, to speak. "Stop," he said. His voice carried perfectly, trained projection, the kind of authority that makes people listen without him having to raise his volume. "Stop right there." I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't part of the program. Student performances were supposed to run straight through, then comments afterward if there were any. But he was walking toward the stage now, his shoes clicking on the hardwood floor of the aisle, and everyone was watching him instead of me. "That piece," he said, climbing the steps to the stage. "Where did you get it?" "I wrote it," I said. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. "It's original." He stopped about 6 feet from the piano, close enough that I could see his expression clearly. There was something in his eyes I couldn't read. Not anger exactly, something colder. "You wrote it," he repeated. "You expect us to believe that you, a second-year student with barely adequate technique, composed something of that harmonic complexity?" My mouth went dry. "I've been working on composition for—" "I know exactly what you've been working on," he cut me off. "I've seen your assignments. Basic 4-part harmony, simple melodic. Construction. Nothing remotely approaching this level of sophistication." He turned to address the audience, not me. "What we've just witnessed is a perfect example of why intellectual honesty matters in the arts. This young man has performed a piece he did not write, claiming it as his own work, hoping that none of you would recognize the source material." "That's not true," I said. My hands were shaking worse now. not from anticipation, but from something that felt like falling. I can show you the drafts, I have the sketches, The only thing you can do, Charles Blackwood said, turning back to me, is apologize to everyone here for wasting their time with this charade. And then you can accept the reality that plagiarism has no place in this program, and that I will not recommend anyone who lacks basic integrity for any opportunity that comes through this department. The room was completely silent. I looked out at the audience and saw faces I knew. Sarah Wilson, who played cello and had helped me understand voice leading. Anthony Cooper, who'd let me use the practice rooms when I didn't have them officially booked. My mother sitting in the back row, her face pale. I wrote this, I said again, but my voice was barely audible now. I can prove it. You'll have the opportunity to explain yourself to the department review board, Charles said. But as of this moment, you are suspended from all ensemble participation, pending an investigation into academic dishonesty. He walked off the stage. The next performer, a violin student named Melissa Garcia, looked at me with something like pity as I gathered my sheet music with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. I walked off the stage through the side exit instead of going back to my seat. I couldn't look at anyone. In the empty hallway outside the auditorium, I leaned against the wall and tried to breathe normally. This wasn't possible. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. I'd spent 2 years writing that piece. I had notebooks full of sketches, failed versions, ideas I'd tried and abandoned. I had the original MIDI files on my computer, with timestamps showing every revision. I had everything I needed to prove authorship, except that apparently none of that mattered, because Charles Blackwood had decided it wasn't mine, and Charles Blackwood was the only person whose opinion counted. I didn't go back inside. I left through the side door and walked home in the dark, still carrying my sheet music, replaying every word he'd said, and trying to understand what had just happened. The meeting with the department review board happened 3 days later. It consisted of Charles Blackwood, the vice principal Diane Moore, and another music teacher named Veronica Taylor who handled the choir program. They sat on one side of a conference table in the administration building. I sat on the other side with my mother, who'd taken off work to be there. I'd brought everything, 3 notebooks full of compositional sketches showing the development of the main theme, printouts of the MIDI file revisions with timestamps going back 18 months, a folder full of rough drafts showing how the harmonic progression had evolved. I'd even brought my composition textbooks with my annotations and notes in the margins. Charles Blackwood didn't look at any of it. The issue here, he said, folding his hands on the table, isn't whether you have supporting materials. Anyone can create retrospective documentation. The issue is whether a student with your demonstrated skill level could have produced work of this caliber. But I did produce it, I said. All of this shows. What this shows, he interrupted, is that you've put significant effort into covering your tracks, which only makes the situation worse. If you'd simply admitted to the plagiarism, we could have addressed it as a learning opportunity about academic integrity. Instead, you've chosen to double down on the deception. Veronica Taylor looked uncomfortable. I think we should at least review the material, she said. If there's documentation showing the creative process. The creative process, Charles said, his voice taking on an edge, is something I've spent 30 years studying and teaching. I know what student work looks like at various levels of development. I know what professional level composition looks like, and I know the difference between the two. Then help me understand, my mother said. It was the first time she'd spoken. Her voice was quiet but steady. Where exactly do you think my son got this piece? If he didn't write it, who did? I don't know, Charles said. There are composition databases online. There are archives of student work from other institutions. There are dozens of sources where someone could find relatively obscure pieces and pass them off as original. The specific source is less important than the pattern of behavior. What pattern? I said. I've never plagiarized anything. I've never cheated. I've done every assignment, Your assignment work is adequate, Charles said. That's precisely the point. Adequate work doesn't suddenly leap to this level of sophistication without years of intervening development. It's not credible. The meeting went on for another 40 minutes, but the outcome was already decided. I could see it in how Charles responded to every piece of evidence I presented with dismissive certainty, in how Vice Principal Moore deferred to his expertise on all technical questions, in how even Veronica Taylor's attempts at fairness were smoothly redirected. The final decision was that I would remain suspended from all ensemble activities for the remainder of the semester. I could continue taking regular music classes, but I would not be allowed to perform publicly or participate in any competitions. My name would be removed from the list of students being considered for conservatory. Recommendations. This is a formative experience, Charles said, as the meeting concluded. Hopefully you'll learn from it and approach your future work with more integrity. I walked out of that room feeling like something inside me had been surgically removed. Not my love of music exactly, but my belief that talent and effort mattered. That if you did the work, if you were good enough, the system would recognize it. That truth was stronger than authority. I was 16 years old, and I'd just learned that none of those things were actually true. The next 2 months were worse than the public humiliation. At least the auditorium incident had been a single moment, sharp and terrible, but finite. What followed was a slow, grinding awareness of how completely one person's opinion could reshape reality. Word spread fast through the music program. By the next day, everyone knew I'd been accused of plagiarism. By the end of the week, it was accepted as fact. Students I'd studied with for 2 years suddenly didn't make eye contact in the hallways. Sarah Wilson stopped saving me a seat in music theory class. Anthony Cooper apologized awkwardly and said he couldn't let me use the practice rooms anymore. Department policy. I tried once to explain what had actually happened, to show Samuel Lee, another composition student, the proof I'd compiled. He looked uncomfortable. "Look, man," he said, "I'm not saying I think you did it, but Charles Blackwood knows what he's talking about, you know. He's conducted professionally. He's taught at this for decades. Why would he accuse you unless he was sure?" I didn't have an answer for that. It was the question that kept me up at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the auditorium scene over and over. Why? What had I done to make him so certain, so committed to this narrative that I'd stolen someone else's work? It took me 3 weeks to find out. I was in the library, supposedly working on a history assignment, but actually just staring at the same page for 20 minutes, when I overheard 2 senior students talking at the next table over. They weren't part of the music program, just regular students, and they weren't being particularly quiet. "Did you see the poster in the main hallway?" one of them said. "Joshua Blackwood got into the National Youth Orchestra." "Blackwood? Like the music teacher's kid?" "Yeah. Apparently he's like a piano prodigy or something. There's a whole article about it in the school newspaper." I sat very still. Joshua Blackwood. Charles Blackwood's son. I'd never had a class with him, never really interacted with him, but I knew who he was. Senior year, tall, always impeccably dressed, played piano at the school assemblies. I'd heard him perform once at a winter concert. He was technically excellent, precise, controlled, very different from my style, which was sloppier but more emotional. I went to the main hallway after the library closed. The poster was there, professionally printed, with a photo of Joshua at a grand piano. The text described his acceptance into the National Youth Orchestra's summer intensive program, his performance history, his planned audition for Juilliard in the fall. Below the main text, in smaller print, Joshua will be performing his award-winning original composition, Reflections in E minor, at the spring concert in April. Something cold settled in my stomach. I went home and spent 4 hours searching through online databases of youth orchestra programs, competition results, music school newsletters. I found a program from the Northeast Regional Music Competition from 2 months earlier. Joshua Blackwood had placed second in the composition category for students ages 16 to 18. The piece was listed as Reflections in E minor, original composition. I pulled up my own files. My piece was called Departure in Minor. I opened the MIDI file and listened to it again, comparing it in my head to what I remembered of Joshua's playing style from that winter concert. Different titles. Different keys, technically, though E minor and D minor shared a lot of harmonic territory. But the structure, the way the themes developed, the specific progression in the middle section where the left hand carried the melody, I wasn't absolutely certain. I needed to hear his piece directly, but the cold feeling in my stomach was spreading, turning into something else, not just cold, burning. The spring concert was scheduled for April 15th. I wasn't allowed to perform in it, obviously, but there was nothing stopping me from attending as an audience member. My mother didn't want me to go. "Why torture yourself?" she asked. We were in the kitchen, her making dinner while I sat at the table, supposedly doing homework. "You've been through enough with this. Just let it go." "I need to hear his piece," I said. "Why? What difference does it make?" I didn't know how to explain it. The difference between knowing and suspecting. The difference between being crazy and being right. The difference between surrendering to the injustice and having one piece of evidence that proved I wasn't insane. I went to the concert alone, sat in the back row, hood up, trying to be invisible. The program was 2 hours long, various ensemble performances, some solos. Joshua Blackwood's performance was scheduled near the end, prime placement. When he walked on stage, Charles Blackwood stood up from his seat in the front row and applauded before anyone else. The audience followed. Joshua sat at the piano, adjusted the bench height, waited for silence. He started playing. Within the first 8 measures, I knew. It wasn't identical. The key was different. Some of the specific voicings had been changed. The tempo was slightly faster, but the core structure was there. The opening motif that established the key. The climbing melody that reached and fell back. The middle section where everything shifted and the left hand suddenly became the focal point. He'd taken my piece and transposed it. Changed enough details to make it technically different, but kept the fundamental architecture that made it work. The thing I'd spent 2 years discovering, the specific combination of elements that created that feeling of wanting and leaving and not quite resolving. I sat through the rest of the concert in a kind of numb fury. When it ended, when everyone was applauding and Charles Blackwood was shaking hands with parents and accepting compliments about his son's extraordinary talent, I walked out without talking to anyone. At home, I pulled up every piece of evidence I had, the dated notebooks, the MIDI files with timestamps, the progression of drafts showing how the piece had evolved. I had everything I needed to prove that my composition predated his by more than a year. I spent the weekend compiling it all into a formal document. Screenshots of file properties showing creation dates, photographs of notebook pages with clearly visible dates in the margins, a detailed analysis comparing the harmonic structures of both pieces, showing the deliberate changes that had been made while preserving the core elements. Monday morning, I requested a meeting with Vice Principal Moore. She looked tired when I walked into her office. "I understand you're upset about the situation," she said before I could start. "But the review board has already made its decision. Continuing to contest it will only make things harder for you." "This isn't about that," I said. I put the folder on her desk. "This is new information, evidence that someone else plagiarized my work and used it in a competition." She opened the folder reluctantly, scanning the first few pages. Her expression didn't change. "These are serious accusations," she said. accusations against another student, and by implication, against a respected member of our faculty. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, I said, though that wasn't quite true. I'm just showing you the evidence. The timestamps prove my composition existed first. The structural analysis shows the similarities. I'm asking you to look at it objectively and— Objectively, she interrupted. I see a student who has already been found responsible for academic dishonesty, now trying to shift blame onto someone else. That's not new evidence. That's escalation. But if you just look at the dates— I've looked at your materials before, she said. Mr. Blackwood explained how retrospective documentation can be created. Timestamps can be altered. Files can be backdated. Without reliable external verification, this doesn't prove anything except that you've put more effort into this deception. I felt something crack inside my chest. So there's nothing I can do? No evidence I can provide that you'll accept? The evidence I would accept, she said carefully, would be an admission of responsibility and a willingness to move forward constructively. Continuing down this path will only damage your standing further. And frankly, if you continue making these accusations against Joshua Blackwood or his father, they would be well within their rights to pursue formal action for defamation. Defamation, I repeated. The word felt foreign in my mouth. These are serious charges you're making, she said, against a student with an impeccable record who has been accepted into prestigious programs based on his demonstrated talent, against a faculty member with 30 years of professional experience and an excellent reputation. You need to think very carefully about whether you want to continue this. I took the folder back, walked out of her office, went to my next class, and sat in the back and didn't hear a word the teacher said. That night, my parents sat me down for what they called a serious conversation. They'd received a call from Vice Principal Moore. She'd expressed concern about my mental state, my apparent inability to accept responsibility, my increasingly confrontational behavior toward faculty and other students. We believe you, my father said. He was a mechanic, worked 60-hour weeks, almost never talked about anything serious. Your mother and I, we believe you wrote that music. But son, sometimes the truth doesn't matter as much as moving on. You're 16. You've got your whole life ahead of you. This thing with the school, with this teacher, it's not worth destroying your future over. He stole my work, I said. He accused me of plagiarism to cover up the fact that his son stole my work. How is that not worth fighting? Because you won't win, my mother said. Her voice was gentle but final. You can't win against someone with that much power and that much to protect. All you can do is hurt yourself trying. So I should just accept it? Just let them get away with it? You should survive it, she said. You should graduate, go to college, build a life. 20 years from now, none of this will matter. That teacher, that school, all of it will be behind you. But only if you let it go now. I wanted to argue. I wanted to scream that justice mattered, that truth mattered, that you couldn't just let people destroy you and call it wisdom to walk away. But I looked at their faces and saw fear. Not fear of the truth. Fear of what fighting for it would cost me. And some small, hateful part of me understood that they were right. I stopped fighting. Not because I believed they were right, but because I understood that fighting was pointless. The system had made its decision. Charles Blackwood was protected by his reputation, his connections, his 30 years of professional credibility. I was a 16-year-old kid with no power, no platform, and no allies. But I didn't forgive, and I didn't forget. I finished out the school year in a kind of numb autopilot. Went to classes, did the assignments, kept my head down. I didn't attend any more music department events. I didn't speak to Charles Blackwood except when absolutely required. When other students asked about the plagiarism incident, I said nothing. Senior year was worse. I'd applied to several music schools, smaller programs where maybe Charles Blackwood's opinion wouldn't carry as much weight. But when the rejection letters started arriving, they all said the same thing in different ways. Insufficient demonstration of original creative work, concerns about academic integrity, recommendation from current faculty did not support admission. He'd done it. He'd made sure that every program I applied to knew about the plagiarism accusation. Not directly, not in any way I could prove or fight, but through the absence of the recommendation that students needed, through quiet conversations with admissions committees, through the professional network that he controlled and I couldn't touch. By March of senior year, I'd been rejected from every music program I'd applied to. My fallback school, the state university, with a decent but not prestigious music department, offered me admission to their general studies program. Not the music school, general studies. I accepted. What choice did I have? My first semester at state was a special kind of hell. I tried to keep music in my life, attended some open performances, hung around the edges of the music program, but every time I heard someone performing composition, I felt this hollow sickness in my chest. That should have been me. I was good enough. I'd proven it. And it had been taken away. I stopped going to performances, stopped listening to music entirely for a while, which felt like cutting off a limb, but less painful than the constant reminder of what I'd lost. I drifted through that semester in general studies, taking random requirements. No direction, no purpose. My grades were mediocre. I didn't care. The one thing I'd been good at, the one thing I'd wanted to build a life around, had been poisoned. Everything else felt like marking time. Second semester, I took an elective in audio engineering because I needed the credits, and it was the only music-adjacent class I could stomach. The professor was this guy named Raymond Stone, maybe 40, who'd worked as a sound engineer for touring bands before burning out and taking a teaching position. He was caustic, blunt, totally uninterested in the artistic pretensions that surrounded most music education. Nobody cares about your creative vision, he said on the first day of class. They care whether their instruments sound good in the mix. They care whether their vocals sit right in the track. They care whether you can make them sound better than they actually are. That's the job. You're not an artist. You're a technician who makes artists sound like they think they sound. It was the most honest thing I'd heard in 2 years. I threw myself into that class with an intensity that surprised me. Not because I loved audio engineering, not because I had some passion for technical work, but because it was the opposite of composition. It was concrete. It was provable. You either made something sound good or you didn't. There was no subjective judgment. No authority figure who could dismiss your work because they didn't like you or needed to protect someone else. Raymond noticed. Halfway through the semester, he pulled me aside after class. "You're good at this," he said. "Better than most of the music students who take this course thinking it'll be easy. You want to actually work in the field?" "I don't know," I said. "Maybe. Because I run a small studio on the side. Nothing fancy. Mostly local bands recording demos, some audiobook work, occasional commercial stuff. I need someone who can handle basic engineering tasks, manage sessions, keep equipment maintained. Pays minimum wage, terrible hours. You interested?" I should have asked more questions. I should have considered whether this was really what I wanted to do with my life. But instead, I just said yes, because it felt like a door opening when all the others had been locked. Working at Raymond's studio was brutal. He wasn't exaggerating about the hours. Sessions ran late into the night, sometimes until 3 or 4 in the morning. Bands would book 4 hours and take 8. Equipment would fail at critical moments. Artists would have breakdowns in the middle of takes, fights with bandmates, creative crises that required careful management, and I loved it. Not the chaos exactly, but the problem solving. The technical challenges, the way you could take a messy, raw recording and shape it into something polished through careful EQ adjustments, compression, spatial effects. The way you could save a bad vocal take with pitch correction and timing edits. the way you could make a mediocre band sound professional if you understood the tools well enough. Raymond taught me everything. Not in any structured way, just through constant exposure and corrections. How to mic a drum kit properly. How to manage gain staging to avoid clipping. How to hear the difference between good compression and over-compression. How to talk to artists in ways that got results without crushing their confidence. The secret, he told me one night while we were mixing a punk band's EP, is that 90% of artists have no idea what they actually sound like. They have this internal version of themselves that's way better than reality. Your job isn't to shatter that illusion. It's to make the reality match the illusion as closely as possible. I worked at the studio for the next 3 years while finishing my degree, not in music. I switched to audio engineering and production, a technical program that focused on the practical aspects of recording rather than performance or composition. It felt like a betrayal at first, abandoning music for something more mechanical. But gradually it started feeling like survival. I learned Pro Tools inside and out, learned signal flow, microphone characteristics, room acoustics, learned how to edit, mix, master, learned the business side, contracts, licensing, publishing rights. Raymond made sure I understood all of it. Not just the creative parts, but the infrastructure that made the industry function. The people who make real money in music, he said, aren't usually the artists. They're the ones who own the means of production, studios, labels, publishing rights, distribution networks. Artists come and go, the infrastructure stays. It was a cynical view, but I was in a cynical place, and it was practical information that would prove useful later. By the time I graduated, I'd logged hundreds of hours of studio time. I'd worked on dozens of projects, from garage bands recording their first demos to semi-professional acts working on albums they hoped would get them signed. I'd developed a reputation for being reliable, technically skilled, and good with difficult artists. Raymond offered me a full-time position at his studio, better pay, benefits, more responsibility. I took it. For the next 2 years, I basically lived there, worked 60, 70-hour weeks, learned everything Raymond knew, and then started learning from other engineers, taking online courses, reading technical manuals, studying the work of people who were better than me. I was 24 years old. I hadn't written a piece of music in 8 years. I'd convinced myself I was over it, that I'd moved on, that the anger had faded into something manageable. But late at night, alone in the studio after everyone else had gone home, I would sometimes pull up that old MIDI file, departure in minor, listen to it through the studio monitors, vastly better speakers than I'd had when I wrote it, and I would remember exactly how it felt to create something real, something that came from inside me and manifested as sound in the world. And I would remember Charles Blackwood's voice saying I had no talent, that I was a plagiarist, that I had no future. I never played it for anyone else, never showed anyone the file. It existed only for me, a private reminder of what had been taken, and over time, without really intending it, that reminder transformed into something else, a promise. At 26, I left Raymond's studio and moved to Nashville. Not because I loved country music, though there was plenty of that there, but because Nashville was one of the few cities where the studio infrastructure was large enough that someone with my experience could actually build something. I had $12,000 saved. I'd been living in a terrible apartment, eating cheap food, putting away every extra dollar for 3 years. $12,000 wasn't nearly enough to start a real studio, but it was enough to rent space, buy some used equipment, and survive for a few months while I tried to build a client base. Those first 6 months in Nashville were harder than anything I'd experienced since high school. I was unknown in a city full of experienced engineers. I was competing with established studios that had better equipment, better acoustics, better everything. I took any session I could get, demo recordings for aspiring country singers, audiobook narration for self-published authors, commercial voiceover work for local businesses. I worked 18-hour days, slept in the studio sometimes because going home felt like wasting time, lived on coffee and whatever cheap food I could grab between sessions, lost 15 pounds I didn't have to lose, developed a persistent cough from the shitty ventilation in my studio space that I couldn't afford to fix properly. But slowly, incrementally, I built something. One client would recommend me to another. A band would like their demo enough to come back for a full EP. An artist would get signed to a small label based on recordings we'd done together, and they'd insist on using me for the professional version. By year 2, I had enough regular clients to hire an assistant, a kid named Kyle Taylor, 22, fresh out of an audio engineering program, willing to work for almost nothing just to get experience. He reminded me of myself at that age, hungry, desperate to prove himself, convinced that technical skill and hard work would be enough. I tried to teach him what Raymond had taught me, but also what I'd learned since. The industry didn't reward fairness or merit. It rewarded leverage. It rewarded relationships. It rewarded being in the right place at the right time with the right connections. So how do I build those connections? Kyle asked me one day. We were between sessions, cleaning equipment, the unglamorous maintenance work that kept everything functioning. You don't build them from the bottom, I said. You build them from the top down. You get one big client, someone with real industry connections, and you make them look so good that they can't afford not to work with you again. Then you use that relationship to get the next one. It's not democratic, it's feudal. You find someone with power and you make yourself indispensable to them. Is that what you're trying to do? No, I said. I'm trying to become the person with power. It sounded arrogant when I said it out loud. A guy running a small studio in Nashville claiming he was going to become important in an industry that chewed up and spit out thousands of people more talented than me every year. But I wasn't joking. I'd spent the last decade learning how the industry worked. Not the romantic version, the story you tell yourself about discovering talent and nurturing artists. The actual mechanics, contracts and publishing rights, production credits and back-end deals, the difference between owning a recording and licensing it, the ways that leverage compounds over time if you're patient and strategic. I was 28 years old. I'd been building towards something without fully articulating what it was. But that conversation with Kyle crystallized it. I didn't want to be a great engineer. I wanted to own the infrastructure. I wanted to be the person who controlled access, who decided which artists got opportunities, who built careers from nothing. I wanted power. The break came from an unlikely source. A songwriter named Melissa Hall walked into my studio with a demo she'd recorded on her phone. She was 24, worked as a waitress, had been writing songs since she was 15. The demo was rough, but the song was exceptional. Real emotional weight, clever lyrics, a melody that stuck in your head immediately. I can't afford real studio time, she said. But I thought maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement. Deferred payment, or equity in the song, or... Most engineers would have said no. Deferred payment meant maybe never getting paid. Equity in a song from an unknown artist meant equity in nothing. But I'd been studying the industry infrastructure. I understood publishing rights. I understood how to structure deals that looked like generous support but actually transferred leverage. Here's what I'll do, I said. I'll produce the track for free. Professional quality, full mix and master. In exchange, I get 50% of the publishing rights, and we co-own the master recording. If the song makes money, we both make money. If it doesn't, you got a professional recording for free. She agreed immediately. Didn't even hesitate. She was desperate for someone to believe in her work, and I was offering her something that looked like belief. We spent 2 weeks on that track. I brought in session musicians I'd worked with before. paid them out of my own pocket. I spent 40 hours on the mix, making every element perfect. The final version was polished, radio-ready, the kind of track that could compete with anything coming out of major label studios. Melissa shopped it around to labels and got nowhere. Small labels thought it was too polished to be authentic. Big labels weren't interested in unknown artists. After 6 months of rejections, she was ready to give up. "What if we release it independently?" I said. "How? I can't afford marketing or distribution or—" "I can. I've been saving money. We put it out digitally, hire someone to work it to radio, build a presence on social media. If it works, you get a career. If it doesn't, I lose some money, but gain experience in the distribution side of things." I didn't tell her that I'd been planning this for months, that I'd been looking for the right track, the right artist, the right opportunity to move from services into ownership. That she was the test case for a model I intended to scale. We released Broken Open in March. I spent $8,000 on marketing and radio promotion. For 2 months, nothing happened. Then a regional radio station in Texas started playing it. Then another in Oklahoma. Then it got picked up by a Spotify playlist. Then country radio started adding it. 6 months after release, Broken Open had 2 million streams. Melissa was getting offers from labels, and I owned 50% of everything. The labels wanted her, but they wanted the rights to the song too. Standard practice. Sign the artist, acquire their catalog, control everything. But I owned half the publishing and half the master. They couldn't get full rights without going through me. I negotiated. Got Melissa a deal with a mid-level label that gave her a 3-album contract and a decent advance. In exchange for my cooperation in licensing the master and publishing rights for Broken Open, I negotiated a production deal for myself. The label would pay me to produce Melissa's debut album, and I would get points on the back end. Melissa was ecstatic. She'd gone from waiting tables to signed artist in 8 months. She didn't fully understand that the deal I'd structured meant I would make more money from her success than she would, at least initially. The production points, the publishing split, the back-end percentage, it all added up to serious money if the album succeeded. The album did succeed, not wildly, but respectably. Sold maybe 50,000 copies in the first year, streamed consistently, produced 2 more singles that got radio play. Melissa built a touring career, opened for larger acts, built a fan base, and I made enough money to upgrade my studio, hire 2 more engineers, start looking at additional artists to develop. That first success with Melissa established a pattern I would repeat dozens of times over the next 5 years. Find artists with real talent but no resources. Offer them professional production in exchange for publishing splits and ownership stakes. Release the music independently first to build leverage. Use that leverage to negotiate better label deals, production contracts, and back-end points. Some of the artists succeeded. Most didn't. But the ones who succeeded made enough money to fund the ones who didn't. And gradually I built a catalog of publishing rights, master recordings, and production credits that generated consistent income even when I wasn't actively working. By 32, I owned a legitimate production company. Not a studio, though I still ran one of those too. An actual company that signed artists, controlled rights, negotiated with labels. I had 7 people working for me. I'd produced tracks that had reached the Billboard charts. I had relationships with A&R reps at major labels. I had leverage, and I'd learned something crucial. The music industry ran on asymmetric information. Artists didn't understand contracts. They didn't understand publishing rights or licensing or the difference between master recordings and composition rights. They just wanted someone to believe in them, to give them a chance, to make them sound professional. I provided all of that, and in exchange, I took pieces of their careers that they didn't value at the time, but that compounded into real wealth if they succeeded. It sounds predatory when I describe it that way. Maybe it was, but I was offering artists opportunities they couldn't get elsewhere. I was providing real value. The fact that I structured deals to maximize my own benefit didn't change, that I was genuinely trying to help them succeed, or at least, that's what I told myself. The Nashville studio had grown into something significant. We occupied a full building now. Professional-grade isolation rooms, high-end monitoring, equipment that rivaled anything in the major label studios. I'd brought on producers who could handle sessions when I was busy with other aspects of the business. I'd built relationships with session musicians, engineers, managers, booking agents. I was 35 years old. I'd built everything from $12,000 in knowledge I'd acquired. Through obsessive study, I owned property, had investments, could afford to take risks that would have destroyed me a decade earlier, and I still thought about Lincoln Park High School at least once a week. It wasn't constant anymore, wasn't the burning rage that had defined my early 20s. But it was there, a low, persistent frequency underneath everything else. I would see a young artist get discouraged by a harsh review and remember how it felt to be publicly accused of plagiarism. I would negotiate with a label executive who thought he could push me around and remember how powerless I'd felt at 16, watching Charles Blackwood destroy my future with words I couldn't fight. I'd thought success would erase it. That building something significant would make the past irrelevant. But success just gave me the perspective to understand how completely I'd been cheated. How different my life might have been if I'd been allowed to pursue music on my own terms, if my composition had been recognized instead of stolen, if I had gone to a conservatory instead of teaching myself production out of spite and survival. I never looked up Charles Blackwood, never checked whether he was still teaching, whether his son had built the career they'd stolen my work to launch. Some part of me knew that if I looked, if I found out they were fine, thriving, untouched by any consequences, it would break something inside me that I'd carefully held together. Better not to know. Better to focus on building something bigger than what they'd taken. Then one day in late October, my assistant brought me a stack of demo submissions. Artists looking for production deals, hoping we'd sign them or at least work with them. I usually listened to maybe 30 seconds of each before deciding, pure efficiency, no time to waste on mediocre work. The 7th demo in the stack made me stop. The voice was good, technically proficient, emotionally present, the kind of controlled performance that suggested real training. But it wasn't the voice that caught my attention. It was the piano accompaniment on the track. I knew that style, the precise touch, the careful dynamics, the technically perfect but emotionally sterile approach. I checked the demo submission form. Joshua Blackwood, age 27, classically trained pianist and vocalist, recent graduate of the New England Conservatory, looking for opportunities in contemporary music production. I sat very still for maybe 30 seconds. Then I pulled up my computer and started searching. Joshua Blackwood had gone to Juilliard for undergrad, spent a few years trying to build a classical performance career, then shifted into contemporary music when the classical world didn't materialize the way he'd expected. He'd released a few singles independently, gotten minimal traction. He was talented, credentialed, and apparently desperate enough to submit demos to production companies in Nashville. I found his social media, professional, photos, carefully curated brand, the aesthetic of someone trying very hard to appear successful. Small following, minimal engagement. The markers of someone who'd had early advantages but couldn't convert them into sustainable career momentum. I found articles about his early career, the National Youth Orchestra acceptance, competition wins, the Juilliard admission, always described as a prodigy, a young talent, someone with tremendous potential. And I found references to his father, Charles Blackwood, retired now from Lincoln Park High School, but still occasionally mentioned in articles about music education, still occasionally quoted as an expert on developing young talent. I pulled up Joshua's demo again, listened to the whole thing this time. 3 tracks, all showcasing his voice and piano skills. Professionally recorded, probably in someone's project studio, but not exceptional production quality. The kind of work that suggested talent but no resources, exactly the kind of artist I usually signed. I sat in my office with the door closed and thought about what I wanted to do. The smart play was probably to delete the submission and forget about it. Joshua Blackwood was a connection to a past I'd spent nearly 20 years trying to move beyond. Getting involved with him, even professionally, risked reopening wounds that had scarred over. But there was an opportunity here. Not for revenge exactly, something more precise. Charles Blackwood had used his power to destroy my career before it started, had stolen my work to launch his son's opportunities, had faced no consequences because I'd been powerless to create any. I wasn't powerless anymore. I had infrastructure. I had leverage. I had the ability to build careers or withhold opportunities. I had everything Charles Blackwood had wielded against me, except I'd earned it through 15 years of brutal work instead of inheriting it through institutional position. And Joshua Blackwood, the son who'd benefited from theft and manipulation, was now submitting demos to my company, looking for exactly the kind of break his father had prevented me from getting. The irony was almost too perfect. I called my A&R director, Angela Garcia. That Joshua Blackwood submission, I want to set up a meeting. Really, I mean, he's good, but he's kind of a weird fit for us. Classical background, no real presence in contemporary. I know, set up the meeting anyway. I want to talk to him. Joshua Blackwood came to Nashville 3 weeks later. I had Angela handle the initial meeting, staying out of it deliberately. I wanted to see what he was like without the complication of him potentially recognizing me. We'd never directly interacted in high school, but there was always a chance. Angela reported back that he was professional, polished, clearly well-trained, but struggling to find his footing in an industry that didn't value his specific skill set as highly as he'd expected. He's desperate, she said. Not showing it, obviously, but you can tell. Juilliard grad, working coffee shop jobs while trying to break into commercial music. He's trying to position himself as versatile, but he's basically starting from scratch at 27 with no real industry connections. What does he want from us? Production deal, ideally, or at minimum, to work with our producers on some tracks that he can shop to labels. He brought a portfolio of compositions, seems to think his songwriting is his strongest asset. What did you think of the compositions? Technically impressive, kind of safe, like someone who learned all the rules but hasn't figured out how to break them effectively. Good enough to work with if we wanted to develop him, not good enough to be immediately commercial. I had her send me Joshua's portfolio, spent an evening going through it. Angela was right. The compositions were competent, occasionally clever, but missing the raw emotional quality that made songs connect with audiences. They felt like exercises, demonstrations of skill rather than genuine expression. Just like his performance of my stolen composition had felt technically perfect, but emotionally hollow. I scheduled a meeting with Joshua for the following week. Told Angela I wanted to evaluate him personally before making any decisions. He didn't recognize me. We sat in my office, him in the chair across from my desk. Professional outfit, carefully styled hair, the posture of someone trying to make a good impression. I kept my expression neutral, businesslike, the same face I used with any potential client. I appreciate you taking the time, Joshua said. I know you must see hundreds of submissions. We see a lot, I agreed. What made you reach out to us specifically? Your roster. You work with artists who have classical training, but are moving into contemporary markets. That's exactly the transition I'm trying to make, and your production quality is exceptional. I listened to the Melissa Hall album maybe 20 times, studying the engineering. It's what I wish my own recording sounded like. Melissa Hall, the artist who'd been my first real success, who'd built a career from nothing with my support and infrastructure. He'd chosen a good example to reference. Why the transition from classical, I asked. Juilliard usually leads to performance or academic careers. His expression flickered with something I recognized. Disappointment carefully masked as strategic choice. The classical world is limited, he said. Extremely competitive, very few opportunities, and success depends heavily on factors beyond just talent and hard work. I spent 3 years trying to build a performance career, got some orchestra positions, some solo work, but the path to sustainability wasn't clear. Contemporary music has more flexibility, more creative freedom, more ways to build an audience. It was a practiced answer, the kind of explanation you give when the truth is too bitter to share with strangers. The truth was probably that he wasn't good enough to make it in the classical world, despite his credentials and connections. That being Charles Blackwood's son had gotten him into Juilliard, but couldn't get him onto the stage at Carnegie Hall. What do you think you bring that would make you successful in contemporary music? I asked. Technical proficiency, he said immediately. Production skills, music theory background, ability to work across different genres, and work ethic. I know what it takes to succeed. I'm willing to put in the time and effort. Standard answers, the kind every artist gives. Nothing that differentiated him or explained why I should invest resources in developing him instead of the dozen other talented people who submitted demos every week. But I already knew I was going to sign him, not because of his talent, because of the opportunity. Here's what I'm thinking, I said, leaning back in my chair. You have skills, you have training, but you need production quality and industry connections to break through. We can provide both. I'm willing to offer you a development deal. We'll produce an EP, 4 tracks, professional quality. We'll help you build a brand and market it strategically. In exchange, we take 60% of publishing and master rights on everything we produce together. His eyes widened slightly. 60% was aggressive, higher than standard industry splits. But it wasn't unprecedented for unknown artists working with established producers. That's a substantial percentage, he said carefully. It is, I agreed. But consider what you're getting. Access to our studio, our engineers, our distribution network, our marketing infrastructure. We'll invest probably $50,000 in producing and promoting your EP. If it succeeds, we both make money. If it doesn't, you walk away with professional recordings you can use however you want. And if I want to retain more rights, then you'll need to bring more to the table. Either fund the production yourself, which I'm guessing you can't afford, or demonstrate existing audience that reduces our risk. Right now, you're asking us to bet on you with no evidence beyond your credentials. The split reflects that risk profile. I watched him calculate. I could see the desperation behind the professional mask, the awareness that this might be his best option in a field where he had no leverage. Can I think about it? He asked. Of course, take a week. But I'll be honest with you, Joshua. We get a lot of submissions. If you want to work with us, I need to know you're committed. Otherwise, I'm going to focus on artists who are. It was a standard pressure tactic. Create artificial scarcity, make him feel like he might miss his opportunity if he hesitated too long. He called back 4 days later and accepted the deal. We started production on Joshua's EP in January. I assigned him to work with Kyle, who was now my senior producer, but I sat in on all the early sessions. Wanted to understand Joshua's creative process, his strengths and limitations, how he responded to direction. He was technically exceptional, could execute any musical idea with precision, took direction well, didn't have the ego problems that plagued a lot of classically trained musicians trying to work in collaborative environments. But Angela had been right about the emotional limitation. His performances were controlled, polished, missing the raw vulnerability that made contemporary music connect. "You're holding back," I told him during the third session. We were working on a ballad he'd written, something about lost opportunities and paths not taken. Decent lyrics, competent melody, but his vocal performance was too measured, too careful. "What do you mean?" he asked. "You're singing the song like you're performing for a panel of judges. Every note perfect, every dynamic exactly where it should be technically. But there's no feeling behind it. The song is about regret. I need to hear actual regret in your voice." "I am expressing the emotion," he said, defensive. "The dynamics, the phrasing. Technical expression isn't the same as genuine emotion. You're not accessing the real feeling. You're performing an idea of the feeling." He looked frustrated. "How do I fix that?" "Think about something that actually makes you feel regret. Something real from your life. Then sing from that place instead of from your technique." I watched him try. Watched him close his eyes and search for something authentic. His next take was better, more connected, though still not quite there. We spent another hour working on it, gradually drawing out more genuine emotion, breaking down the defensive perfectionism that classical training had instilled. During a break, while Kyle was adjusting levels, Joshua asked me about my background. "Angela mentioned you were self-taught. How did you get into production?" "Audio engineering program in college," I said. "Worked in studios for years, learned the business side, eventually started my own company. Pretty standard path." "Did you ever want to perform, write music yourself?" The question hit harder than he could have known. I kept my expression neutral. "I did for a while, but I figured out I was better at helping other people realize their vision than pursuing my own. Found it more satisfying to build infrastructure than to be the artist." "I respect that," he said. "Not everyone has the discipline to recognize where their actual talents lie." It was an innocent comment, but something about the phrasing made my jaw tighten. Where your actual talents lie, as if talent was something objective, something that authority figures could definitively judge, rather than something that power decided to recognize or ignore. I didn't respond. We went back to recording. Over the next 3 months, we produced 4 tracks for Joshua's EP. I made sure the production quality was exceptional, brought in talented session musicians, spent serious time on the mix and master. Whatever else I was doing, I wanted the final product to be genuinely good. The EP came together well. Joshua's performances improved as we worked, becoming less technically perfect, but more emotionally present. The songs were solid, if not exceptional. The production was polished and professional. We released Echoes and Errors in May with a modest marketing budget, got it placed on some Spotify playlists, worked it to relevant radio, built social media presence. The reception was okay. Not a breakout success, but respectable streaming numbers, decent reviews from music blogs, enough momentum to suggest there might be an audience worth developing. Joshua was ecstatic. He'd gone from struggling musician with no prospects to signed artist with professional releases and growing attention. He didn't know that the contract he'd signed gave me effective control over every aspect of his career. Publishing rights, master recordings, creative direction, marketing strategy. He thought he was building his career. He was actually building mine. 3 months after the EP release, I called him in for a meeting. "The EP performed well enough that I want to move forward with an album," I said. "Full length, 10 to 12 tracks, bigger marketing budget. But I need full creative control. You'll have input on song selection and performance, but final decisions on production, arrangement, marketing strategy, All of that comes through me. That's a lot of control to give up, he said carefully. It's how you build a sustainable career. You're talented, but you don't have the experience or industry knowledge to make strategic decisions that will maximize your success. I do. Trust the process. He hesitated. I could see him calculating, trying to maintain some sense of artistic autonomy while recognizing that he needed me more than I needed him. What about songwriting credits, he asked. If I write the songs, you'll get writing credits, but remember our agreement. 60-40 split on publishing, that doesn't change. Right, he said. I just want to make sure my contribution is recognized. Your contribution. As if the songs he wrote, using techniques and structures he'd learned from stolen work, deserved special protection. Your contribution will be recognized exactly as much as the contract specifies, I said. Are you in or not? He was in. The album process took 8 months. I pushed Joshua harder than I'd pushed any artist, demanded takes and retakes until the performances were exactly what I wanted, involved myself in every creative decision. It was excessive, more controlling than I needed to be, purely from a production standpoint. But this wasn't purely about production. I was reshaping his career into something dependent, something where every success was mediated through my approval, where he couldn't move forward without my infrastructure and support. Exactly the way Charles Blackwood had controlled the trajectory of students at Lincoln Park High School, except I was doing it through contracts and leverage rather than institutional position. The album, titled Borrowed Time, released in March to better reception than the EP. It hit the iTunes charts in its first week, got some national radio play, generated decent revenue. Joshua started getting offers for small venue performances, opening slots with larger acts. His career was developing exactly the way I'd engineered it to. And then, 6 months after the album release, I got the call that made everything click into place. My lawyer, James Cooper, reached out about a copyright issue that had emerged during routine clearance work. We found something weird in the archives, he said. Remember that clause in Joshua Blackwood's contract, where we get access to his full creative history for archival and promotional purposes? Yes. Well, we found recordings from a high school competition. He performed a piece listed as Reflections in E minor, original composition. But when we ran it through our database for copyright clearance, it flagged a structural match with something in your personal files. My heart rate increased. What file? Something called Departure in Minor, dated 15 years earlier. The melodic and harmonic structures are substantially similar. Not identical, but similar enough that it could be a copyright issue if he's claiming full originality. I sat very still. Send me both files. I spent that evening listening to them side by side, analyzing the structures, mapping the similarities, the key change, the slight tempo adjustment, the subtle variations in voicing. They were all there, but the fundamental architecture was identical. The same climbing melody, the same harmonic progression in the middle section, the same specific combination of elements that I'd spent 2 years developing. He'd taken my composition, made superficial changes, and entered it in a competition as his own work. Not because he was a plagiarist by nature, probably, but because his father had recognized the quality of the work and needed something strong enough to establish Joshua's credibility, and the easiest path was to take the piece that was already there, rework it just enough to create plausible deniability, and present it as his son's composition. And it had worked. That competition placement had helped build the resume that got Joshua into Juilliard. His entire career trajectory had been launched on work that wasn't his. I had proof now. Dated files, structural analysis, enough evidence to create a legitimate copyright claim. But going public would be messy. Joshua might not have known about the plagiarism. He could have believed his father when told the piece was his own composition, could have performed it in good faith. Creating a scandal would damage him, might damage my company by association, and wouldn't accomplish what I actually wanted. What I wanted was control, and I already had that. I called James back. How do the copyright dates work if he performed it publicly before I officially registered it? Performance doesn't establish ownership. Original creation does. Your files are dated years before his performance. If you registered it now, you'd own the copyright retroactively. Anything he's earned from that composition or derivative works would technically belong to you. And our contract gives us access to his full catalog? For works created during the term of the agreement, yes. This predates the contract, but the fact that he submitted it as part of his creative history means we have a claim. Register it, I said. Official copyright in my name for departure in minor. Then send Joshua a formal notice that we're claiming rights to any derivative works, including Reflections in E minor. That's going to create serious conflict. That's fine. The meeting with Joshua happened a week later. He arrived at my office confused and defensive, clearly having consulted with a lawyer of his own who'd explained how serious the copyright claim was. I don't understand what's happening, he said. He looked genuinely rattled, the professional polish stripped away. You're claiming you own a piece I performed 8 years ago? Not claiming, I said calmly. The Copyright Office has confirmed my ownership based on dated files showing original creation. Your performance of a derivative work doesn't change that. But I wrote that piece. I mean, my father helped me with some of the development, but your father, I repeated, Charles Blackwood, who taught at Lincoln Park High School. Joshua's expression shifted slightly. Yes, he was the music director there for years. He's retired now. I know. I went to Lincoln Park. I was in his program. I watched Joshua process this, trying to place me in his memory, scanning for recognition. We'd never interacted directly, but he would have seen me around the school, might have heard about the plagiarism incident. Did you know each other? He asked carefully. We met once, briefly. I performed an original composition at a school concert. Your father accused me of plagiarism in front of an auditorium full of people, said I had no talent and no future, got me suspended from the music program, blocked my conservatory applications, effectively ended any chance I had at a music career. Joshua went very pale. I didn't know about that. 2 months later, you performed Reflections in E minor at a regional competition. Listed as your original composition, won second place. That award helped you get into Juilliard. My father gave me that piece, Joshua said. His voice was barely steady. He said he'd been working on it with another student who dropped out of the program. He helped me refine it. We made changes together. I thought, you thought what? That work another student created just became yours because your father said so? I was 17. I trusted my father. If he told me it was okay to perform it, I believed him. He wasn't wrong. 17 years old, told by a parent that something was acceptable, you'd believe it. Especially when the parent was a respected authority figure, someone who'd spent decades in the field. Joshua probably had believed he was performing a legitimately collaborative piece, but that didn't change what had been taken from me, and it didn't change the opportunity I had now. Here's the situation, I said, keeping my voice level. I own the copyright to the original composition. That means I own rights to any derivative works, including your performance and recording of Reflections in E minor. You've earned money from that piece, through performances and recordings. Legally, that money belongs to me. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious, but I'm not interested in destroying you over something your father did. So here's what I'm offering. We restructure your contract. I get 80% of all publishing and master rights going forward instead of 60. You continue recording and performing under my direction, with my producers, on my terms. In exchange, I don't pursue legal action over the copyright violation and don't make this situation public. 80%, Joshua repeated. That would mean I'm basically working for you. Everything I create, you'd own most of it. Yes. That's not a career. That's indentured servitude. It's the career you have, I said, because the alternative is I file a formal copyright claim, expose how your early success was built on plagiarism, and tank any chance you have at credibility in this industry. Your choice. I watched him struggle with it, saw the exact same calculation I'd seen on his face when I first offered him the development deal. Desperation versus dignity, opportunity versus autonomy. He signed the restructured contract 3 days later. Over the next 2 years, I built Joshua Blackwood into a successful recording artist. Not because I cared about his success, but because proving I could do it demonstrated my complete control over his career trajectory. I selected his material, decided which songs he'd record, which he'd perform, how he'd present himself publicly. I shaped his brand into something commercial and accessible, moving him away from the classical pretensions he naturally gravitated toward and into contemporary pop that had broader appeal. The second album did well, made the Billboard 200, generated substantial streaming revenue, led to a booking agent and tour opportunities. Joshua became modestly famous, recognized in certain music circles, building a fan base. And every bit of that success ran through me. The contracts I'd structured meant I controlled not just his recordings, but his publishing, his performance rights, his ability to work with other producers or labels. He was locked in, dependent on my infrastructure for everything. He hated it. I could see it in how he interacted with me during production sessions, the careful professional courtesy that barely masked resentment. He knew he was trapped, knew that walking away would mean abandoning everything he'd built, all the momentum and recognition and audience development. But he couldn't walk away because I'd structured the contracts to make that economically impossible. During a production meeting for his third album, Kyle pulled me aside. "What are you doing with Blackwood?" he asked quietly. "What do you mean?" "You're pushing him in directions that don't suit his strengths. The material you're selecting, the brand you're building, it's commercially successful, but it's not letting him develop artistically. It feels like you're deliberately keeping him boxed in." "I'm building his career," I said. "No, you're controlling it. There's a difference, and I think you know that." Kyle had been with me long enough to speak directly. He'd earned that right. But this wasn't something I could explain to him. Joshua signed a contract that gives me creative control. I'm exercising that control in ways that maximize both our interests. Are you, though? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're maximizing your leverage and minimizing his autonomy. That's not the same as maximizing success. He's on the Billboard charts, Kyle. He's selling out venues. How is that not success? Because he's miserable. You can see it in every session. He's professionally successful and personally trapped. And I think you designed it that way deliberately. I didn't respond. Kyle held my gaze for a moment, then shook his head. Whatever happened between you and him or his family, it's turning you into someone I don't recognize. The guy who gave Melissa Hall her first break, who believed in artists when no one else would. That's not who's running Joshua Blackwood's career right now. He left before I could answer. That conversation stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit, because Kyle was right. I wasn't managing Joshua's career the way I managed other artists. With Melissa and the others, I'd genuinely tried to find the intersection between commercial viability and artistic vision. With Joshua, I was imposing vision regardless of his input, making decisions that kept him successful but constrained. I was doing to him exactly what Charles Blackwood had done to me, using power to shape someone's career for my benefit rather than theirs. Except Joshua had the career. He had success, recognition, financial stability. What I'd taken was autonomy and creative freedom. What I'd gained was leverage and control. Was that enough? The final phase came during production of Joshua's third album. We'd been working together for 3 years. He was 30 years old, established enough that he could potentially survive terminating our relationship if he was willing to start over. But he hadn't. He'd stayed locked into our contract, continued working under my direction, because the alternative was too risky. I'd been strategically selecting material that pushed him further from his classical roots and deeper into commercial pop. Nothing terrible, nothing embarrassing, but consistently in directions that eroded what he might have built if left to his own creative instincts. And then I found the perfect final piece. A songwriter I worked with had written something for a children's entertainment company. Upbeat, silly, designed for birthday parties and family events. It was catchy, professionally crafted, and completely beneath the level Joshua had operated at, even during his most commercial work. I presented it during a production meeting. "This is Happy Birthday Robot," I said. "We're going to record it as the lead single for a companion EP targeting the family market. Different demographic, new revenue stream." Joshua looked at the sheet music with barely concealed horror. "This is for children. It's for a family audience. There's substantial money in that market." "I'm not a children's entertainer. That's not my brand. That's not..." "Your brand is whatever I decide it is, and right now, diversifying into family content makes strategic sense. This will destroy my credibility with my existing audience. Your existing audience is already established. This is about expansion." "No," Joshua said. He set the music down. "I'm not doing this. I've gone along with everything else, every direction you've pushed me. But this is too far. This isn't music. This is humiliation. It's a commercial opportunity covered by our contract." "Then maybe it's time to revisit the contract. I've made you a lot of money over the last 3 years. I've done everything you've asked. I deserve more creative input, better terms, actual partnership instead of servitude." I'd been waiting for this moment. The inevitable breaking point where he'd finally push back, demand better treatment, try to renegotiate from a position of demonstrated value. "You want to renegotiate?" I said calmly. "Then let's talk about what you bring to the table. You have talent, yes, but you also have a career built on stolen work. You benefited from plagiarism even if you didn't know it at the time. Your entire trajectory was launched through dishonesty. That wasn't my fault. I was 17, I trusted my father. And I was 16 when your father destroyed my career to protect yours. The difference is I've spent 20 years building something real. You've spent the last 3 benefiting from infrastructure I created. So no, we're not renegotiating. You're going to record Happy Birthday Robot, and you're going to perform it at family events, and you're going to smile while you do it. Because the alternative is I make our full history public, including the copyright claim and the plagiarism that launched your career." Joshua looked at me with something I hadn't seen before. Not resentment or frustration, recognition. "You've been planning this the whole time," he said quietly. "Since the moment I submitted that demo. This was never about building my career. It was about controlling it. I've built your career more than you would have managed alone. You've turned me into a puppet. Everything I've achieved, it's under your terms, your control. I thought you were helping me, but you were just..." "What? Getting revenge on my father by controlling his son?" The accusation landed harder than I expected, because it was true, and hearing it stated plainly made it sound smaller than it had felt in my head. Petty. Not the sophisticated strategic victory I'd told myself I was achieving, but just hurting someone who'd hurt me by proxy. "Your father stole 2 years of work from me," I said. "He destroyed my future to build yours. He faced no consequences. So yes, I took the opportunity to ensure that everything you build through me, that your success is mediated through someone whose career he tried to end. If that's revenge, fine, but it's revenge I earned. My father is 70 years old, Joshua said. He's been retired for 5 years. He has no idea what's happening here. Whatever satisfaction you think you're getting, it's not affecting him. It's just destroying me. Then maybe you should have built your career on your own work instead of stolen material. I didn't know it was stolen, but you benefited from it anyway. Just like I'm benefiting now from the career you wouldn't have without my infrastructure. Seems fair to me. Joshua stood up. For a moment I thought he might just walk out, terminate the relationship entirely despite the financial cost. But he didn't. He picked up the sheet music for Happy Birthday Robot. I'll record it, he said. His voice was flat, empty. I'll do whatever the contract requires, but I want you to know that you're not getting revenge on my father. You're not even getting revenge on me. You're just proving that you're exactly the same as him. You're using power to destroy someone weaker because it makes you feel in control. That's all this is. And 20 years from now, when you're 70 and retired, I hope you remember that the thing you became to get revenge on the person who hurt you was the exact same thing that hurt you in the first place. He left. I sat in my office for a long time after, staring at nothing. Joshua recorded Happy Birthday Robot exactly as contracted. We released it as part of a family entertainment EP, marketed it to birthday party entertainment services, created a whole brand around it. It was commercially successful in its niche market, generated revenue, damaged his credibility with his original audience exactly as he'd predicted. I restructured his performance schedule to include children's birthday parties and family events, pushed him further into the brand I'd created, away from anything resembling the artistic career he'd imagined for himself. He complied with everything, never fought again after that final confrontation, just showed up, performed what was required, collected his 20% of revenue from work he didn't choose and didn't believe in. I should have felt satisfied. I'd done what Charles Blackwood had done to me, except worse. I hadn't just blocked someone's opportunities. I'd given them success on terms that made it feel like failure. I'd proven I could build and control careers with precision, could turn talent into product, could exercise power more completely than the person who'd once wielded it against me. But Kyle's words kept echoing. I'd become something I didn't recognize. I'd started this company to create opportunities, to help artists achieve what they couldn't achieve alone. Somewhere along the way, with Joshua specifically, it had transformed into something else. Not helping, controlling, using leverage to shape another person's life, not for their benefit but for my satisfaction. And the worst part was that Joshua was right. Charles Blackwood had no idea what I was doing to his son. He was retired, living somewhere in New England, probably proud of how Joshua's career had developed, unaware of how thoroughly controlled it was. The revenge wasn't touching him. It was only destroying Joshua, who'd been 17 years old, and trusting when his father gave him stolen work to perform. 6 months after the Happy Birthday Robot release, I was reviewing quarterly financials when Angela brought me a message. Joshua Blackwood wants to meet with you. Says it's important. I hadn't spoken to him directly in weeks. Our interactions had been handled through producers and managers. I almost said no, but something made me agree. He came to my office looking exhausted. Not physically tired, but emotionally drained. The kind of exhaustion that comes from sustained misery. I wanted to tell you in person, he said. I'm done. I'm terminating the contract, walking away from everything. I know what it costs. I'll have to pay back the advance, forfeit all the rights, probably work for years just to clear the debt. But I can't do this anymore. It's destroying me. I should have let him go, should have recognized that I'd already proven whatever point I was trying to prove. But instead I said, You have 3 more years on the contract. Walking away now means you'll never work in this industry again. I know, I've accepted that. I'd rather have no career than the career you've built for me. Your father destroyed my future, I said. Why should you get to just walk away when I couldn't? Because I'm not my father. I didn't destroy your future. He did. And yes, I benefited from what he did, but I was a child. I didn't choose it. I didn't understand what was happening, and I've paid for it. 3 years of working under your control, watching you deliberately shape my career into something humiliating, knowing I couldn't fight back because you'd bury me if I tried. That's enough. I'm done paying for his mistakes. He set a formal termination notice on my desk. You'll hear from my lawyer about the financials. I know it'll take years to clear the debt, but I'd rather be free and poor than successful and controlled by someone who hates me. He walked out. I sat with the termination notice for a long time, read through the formal language acknowledging breach of contract, accepting financial penalties, requesting release from all future obligations. I could fight it. The contract was airtight. I could keep him locked in for 3 more years, continue exercising control, continue building the career that demonstrated my power, or I could let him go. I called James Cooper. Joshua Blackwood is terminating his contract. I want you to draw up a mutual release. He pays back half the advance, keeps the rights to work he created during our partnership, and we sever all future obligations. That's extremely generous, given the contract terms. I know. May I ask why? Because I've made my point, and because continuing this just makes me into someone I don't want to be. The release was finalized 3 weeks later. Joshua paid back $200,000, a fraction of what he'd technically owed. He retained rights to his catalog, which meant he could continue earning from past work without my control. He was free. I'm 41 years old now. Joshua terminated our partnership 6 years ago. I haven't spoken to him since. I've tracked his career peripherally. He never made it back to the level he'd achieved under my management, but he's working, teaching, performing occasionally on his own terms. He looks happier in recent photos than I ever saw him during our partnership. Charles Blackwood passed away 3 years ago. I only found out through an obituary. It mentioned his distinguished career, his contributions to music education, his successful son Joshua. It didn't mention Lincoln Park High School or stolen compositions or the kids whose futures he derailed to protect his own legacy. The company I built is larger now. I work with maybe 30 artists at various stages of their careers. I've tried to go back to the model I used with Melissa. Genuine partnership, fair terms, trying to find the intersection between commercial viability and artistic vision. But some of the artists I work with now are savvier than Melissa was. They've heard stories about Joshua Blackwood, about the controlling producer who built someone's career and then deliberately shaped it into something humiliating. The story gets exaggerated in the retelling, becomes a cautionary tale about signing with producers who take too much control. I don't correct the stories. They're not entirely wrong. Late at night, alone in the studio, I sometimes pull up that original file, Departure in Minor, listen to it through professional monitors, hear all the rough edges and amateur choices, but also hear the genuine emotion I'd poured into it at 16. The feeling of wanting something I couldn't name, of being young and knowing everything was temporary but not knowing what came next. I did figure out what came next. I built a successful company, made enough money to be comfortable, helped launch careers for artists who might not have had opportunities otherwise, proved that someone with no connections and no institutional support could build something significant through strategic thinking and relentless work. But I also spent 3 years turning another person's career into a demonstration of my power. Took someone who'd never directly harmed me and systematically destroyed their artistic autonomy because their father had destroyed mine. Became exactly the thing I'd hated, just with better justification. Joshua was right. The revenge didn't touch Charles Blackwood. It only proved that I could wield power as cruelly as he had, that given the opportunity, I would prioritize control over fairness, that whatever idealistic motivation I told myself I had could be corrupted by the memory of old wounds. I won. I built a career that Charles Blackwood said I'd never have. I became powerful in an industry where he's footnote. I proved that talent and effort could overcome institutional barriers if you were patient and strategic enough. But the victory tastes like ash, because what I achieved came at the cost of becoming someone who hurt people, not to protect myself or build something meaningful, but simply because I could, because I had the leverage and the opportunity and the justification of old grievances. I didn't get revenge on Charles Blackwood. He lived and died, probably never knowing how his actions had shaped my entire life trajectory. I got revenge on his son, who was guilty only of being born to the wrong father and trusting him. And that revenge, that demonstration of power, that systematic destruction of someone's artistic autonomy, that didn't heal the wound from high school. It didn't give me back the 2 years I'd lost or the career I might have had. It just proved that 16-year-old kid standing on that stage, holding sheet music that represented 2 years of secret work, believing that talent and effort mattered. He was wrong about more than just how the system worked. He was wrong about who he'd become if the system broke him. I still run the company, still sign artists and build careers and exercise power in an industry I understand better than most. But late at night, listening to that composition I wrote at 16, I don't hear the future I thought I was reaching for. I hear the last moment I believed that being good at something was enough. Before I learned that power mattered more than talent, before I learned that the only protection against being destroyed by someone stronger was becoming the strongest person in the room. Before I learned that becoming the strongest person in the room meant eventually becoming the person you'd hated for destroying you. The composition ends the way it always did, reaching but never resolving, wanting something unnamed, temporary but not knowing what comes next. I know what came next now, and I won. But what I won doesn't feel like victory. It feels like becoming Charles Blackwood. And that's the real revenge. Not what I did to his son, but what his destruction of my future turned me into. What I proved I was capable of when given the power he'd once wielded. He didn't just steal my composition. He stole the person I might have become if I'd been allowed to believe that fairness mattered. And by the time I'd built enough power to prove him wrong, I'd already proven him right about what the industry does to people who survive it. That's what I think about late at night in the studio. Not triumph, not satisfaction at career success, or financial security, or all the artists I've helped along the way. Just the quiet certainty that 16-year-old kid with his secret composition would look at who I became and feel nothing but disappointment, and that no amount of power or success or revenge will ever change that. Stories like this happen more often than we think. Subscribe if you want to hear the ones that usually stay unspoken. And if this story made you pause, a like helps the channel grow.